I still remember the night my 38-year marriage ended, even though it happened 10 years ago. I opened my front door just after midnight and saw my wife quietly walking toward another man's car. She looked over her shoulder to make sure I was not watching, then smiled at him in a way I had not seen her smile at me in years. I stood there without making a sound as they drove away together. My name is John Carter. I am 71 years old now, and what I am about to tell you is the hardest story I have ever shared. Back then, I believed my wife and I were simply growing old together. She had stopped eating dinner with me, stopped asking about my day, and always found an excuse to leave the house after dark. She told me she was visiting a sick friend, helping a neighbor, or going for a walk because she could not sleep. I wanted to believe her because after nearly 4 decades of marriage, trust came more naturally than suspicion. But little by little, the lies became impossible to ignore. Some nights she would not return until sunrise. Other mornings I noticed she was wearing perfume she never used around me. She hid her phone whenever I entered the room and deleted every message before leaving it on the table. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, she smiled without looking into my eyes and said, "You worry too much, John." I wanted to believe those words, but my heart already knew something had changed. Then one evening I found a restaurant receipt in her coat pocket. It showed dinner for 2 at a place where she had never taken me. I folded the receipt, put it back exactly where I found it, and said nothing. That was the moment I decided I would stop asking questions and start looking for answers. 3 nights later, she quietly left the house again just after midnight. This time I picked up my car keys, waited until she turned the corner, and followed her from a distance. I had no idea that before the sun came up, I would discover a betrayal that would change the rest of my life forever. She had no idea I was following her that night. I kept several cars between us, afraid she might recognize my old pickup if I got too close. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not because I was angry, but because I was terrified of what I was about to discover. After 38 years of marriage, I prayed I was wrong. I prayed there was a simple explanation for everything I had seen. But 20 minutes later, she turned into the driveway of a small house on the edge of town. The porch light came on before she even reached the front door, as if someone had been waiting for her. An older man opened the door with a smile, and without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around my wife. My heart sank. She smiled back in a way I had not seen for years. I stayed inside my truck, unable to move, watching through the window as they laughed together. A few minutes later, they sat at the same table, shared dinner, and held each other's hands. It looked like the life she no longer wanted with me. I could have walked away, but something inside me refused to believe that 38 years could end without a single answer. Nearly 2 hours passed before the lights inside the house went off. Then I saw something that broke whatever hope I still had. They disappeared into the same room, and the bedroom light came on a few seconds later. I closed my eyes because I already knew what I thought it meant. Every promise we had made, every birthday, every anniversary, every sacrifice suddenly felt meaningless. I started my truck and drove home before sunrise. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply sat alone in my kitchen until she returned a little after 6 in the morning. She walked inside as if nothing had happened, smiled at me and asked, "You are awake already?" I looked into her eyes and realized I was sitting across from someone I no longer recognized. I wanted to confront her, but I knew accusations without proof would only give her another lie to hide behind. So I forced myself to stay calm because I had already decided that the next time she went back to that house, I would walk through the front door myself. I did not say a single word to my wife that morning. I smiled, drank my coffee, and acted as if nothing had happened. Inside, however, I felt like my entire life had fallen apart. For the next 3 days, I watched everything she did. She kept pretending to be the same loving wife, but I noticed every lie. She spent more time on her phone, left the room whenever it rang, and always locked the screen before I could see it. Every evening, she became strangely excited as midnight got closer. She even bought a new dress and a bottle of perfume she never wore for me. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. On the 4th night, just after midnight, she quietly picked up her purse and walked out of the house again. This time, I did not follow her by car. I parked a few streets away and reached the old man's house before she did. I hid behind a large tree across the road where I could clearly see the front door. A few minutes later, her car arrived. She stepped out, looked around carefully, then hurried inside. The old man welcomed her with another hug before closing the door. I waited nearly an hour before gathering enough courage to cross the street. Every step toward that house felt heavier than the last. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. When I finally reached the front porch, I looked through a small gap in the curtain. What I saw made my hands shake with anger. My wife and that man were sitting close together on the couch, laughing, holding each other, and kissing as if I had never existed. At that moment, every doubt disappeared. I was no longer wondering whether she was betraying me. I knew she was. My hand slowly reached for the doorknob, and without thinking about what might happen next, I turned it. I pushed the door open so hard that it slammed against the wall. The sound echoed through the house, and both of them jumped to their feet. My wife turned pale the moment she saw me. The old man stepped in front of her as if he was trying to protect her, and that single move made my blood boil. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I looked at the woman I had loved for nearly 4 decades and could barely recognize her. "So this is where you have been every night," I said. My voice was calm, but inside I was falling apart. She opened her mouth to explain, yet no words came out. The old man finally broke the silence. "John, this is not what you think," I laughed bitterly. "I watched the two of you for weeks. I saw you holding hands. I saw you kissing. And you still expect me to believe there is another explanation?" My wife began crying, but her tears no longer changed anything for me. I had spent years trusting her while she built another life behind my back. "How long?" I asked. She lowered her head. "Almost 2 years," she whispered. Those 4 words hurt more than anything else I had heard that night. 2 years of lies. 2 years of pretending everything was normal. 2 years of making me feel like I was the problem whenever I questioned her. I looked around the room and noticed framed photographs of the two of them together. They had celebrated birthdays, gone on trips, and shared moments while I sat alone at home believing my wife was helping a sick friend. My entire marriage suddenly felt like a lie. I slowly took off my wedding ring and placed it on the table between them. "Keep it," I said. "It means nothing now." My wife rushed toward me, begging me not to leave, but I stepped back. "You made your choice a long time ago," I said. "Tonight, I am finally making mine." I turned toward the front door without looking back. As I reached my truck, I heard her calling my name over and over. But after what I had seen inside that house, there was nothing left for us to say. I drove away believing the worst part of my life was finally over. I had no idea that what happened inside that house was only the beginning of something even more painful. I drove through the empty streets until the sun began to rise. I could not bring myself to go home. So I parked beside a quiet lake where my wife and I used to spend our anniversaries. I sat there for hours, staring at the water and wondering how 38 years of marriage could fall apart in a single night. Around 9 that morning, my phone started ringing. It was my wife. I ignored the call. She called again and again. Then dozens of messages began appearing on my screen. Every message said the same thing. "Please let me explain." I deleted everyone without reading the rest. By the afternoon, I finally returned home. The house felt empty, even though all of our furniture was still there. Her closet was half open, but many of her clothes were gone. On the kitchen table sat a handwritten letter with my name on it. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away. But after everything that had happened, I wanted to know why she had destroyed our life. I opened the letter with shaking hands. She admitted she had been seeing the other man for almost 2 years. She wrote that she never meant to hurt me, that she had fallen in love with someone who understood her. Those words cut deeper than any knife. For nearly 4 decades, I had worked long hours, cared for our home, stood beside her through illness and loss, and believed we were growing old together. Yet she chose another man and expected a letter to erase the betrayal. At the bottom of the page, she asked me not to file for divorce until we talked one last time. I folded the letter, placed it back on the table, and walked upstairs. I opened our bedroom door and looked around at the life we had built together. Every picture on the wall now felt like a lie. I quietly packed a small suitcase, collected a few important documents, and took one last look at the room before walking away. As I reached the front door, someone knocked. I opened it expecting to see my wife. Instead, the old man she had been meeting stood on my porch. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "John, there is something about your wife that you still do not know." I looked at the old man standing on my porch and felt my anger rise all over again. Of all the people I expected to see that morning, he was the last one. "You have a lot of nerve coming here," I said. He did not argue or try to defend himself. Instead, he quietly said, "I know you hate me, John, but if you do not listen to me for 5 minutes, you will spend the rest of your life believing a lie." I almost slammed the door in his face, but something in his voice made me stop. He looked tired, nervous, and nothing like the confident man I had seen the night before. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. You have 5 minutes, I said. He took a deep breath before speaking. Your wife did betray your marriage, and I will never deny that. But there is something she never told you because she was too afraid. I folded my arms. There is nothing left to hear. He slowly shook his head. 10 years ago, before she ever met me, she went to a doctor alone. My heart sank, but I stayed silent. She came home that day carrying news that changed her forever. She was diagnosed with a serious illness, and she believed she would not have many years left. I stared at him without saying a word. He continued, instead of telling you, she chose to hide it. She believed you had already sacrificed enough for your family, and she did not want the rest of your life to become years of hospitals and fear. I wanted to reject every word he said, but I remembered how she had changed years earlier. The doctor visits she never explained. The nights she cried when she thought I was asleep. The medication bottles that disappeared before I could read the labels. He looked at me and quietly added, she made terrible choices, John. She lied to you. She hurt you. But not every secret she kept was because she stopped loving you. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my wife. This time, instead of letting it ring, I answered. I did not say a word. All I heard was her voice through tears. John, I am at the hospital. Then the line went dead. I froze with the phone still pressed against my ear. Her last words echoed in my mind. John, I am at the hospital. The call ended before I could ask anything. For a few seconds I could not move. Then I looked at the old man. What hospital? I asked. He immediately gave me the name, and without another word, we both got into our cars and drove there. During the drive, my mind was filled with questions. Was she really sick? Or was this another lie? Had she planned this to make me forgive her? After everything I had seen with my own eyes, trusting her felt impossible. 20 minutes later, I rushed through the hospital entrance and saw my wife sitting alone in the emergency waiting area. She looked nothing like the woman I had confronted the night before. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling, and she looked exhausted. When she saw me, tears filled her eyes. She slowly stood up and whispered, I did not think you would come. I looked at her without saying a word. The anger inside me was still there, but seeing her in that condition confused me. A doctor walked toward us carrying a medical file. He looked at me and asked, Are you Mr. John Carter? I nodded. He sighed before speaking. Your wife has been receiving treatment for a serious heart condition for almost 2 years. I turned toward her in disbelief. 2 years. The same 2 years she had been meeting the other man. My wife lowered her head. I wanted to tell you so many times, she said through tears. But every time I tried, I was afraid you would spend the rest of your life worrying about me. I clenched my fists. So instead, you chose another man? She cried harder. No, I chose the wrong way to escape my fear. Before I could answer, the doctor handed me another envelope. She asked us to give you this if she ever came here alone. I slowly opened it, expecting another apology. Instead, I found medical reports and one handwritten sentence that made my heart stop. John, there is one more truth I have hidden from you for 38 years. And after you read it, nothing about our marriage will ever be the same. I drove to the hospital faster than I had driven anywhere in years. My hands were shaking, and my mind was filled with questions I never thought I would ask. When I reached the emergency entrance, I saw the old man standing there waiting for me. For the first time, there was no confidence in his face. He simply pointed toward the intensive care unit. I walked through the doors and saw my wife lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines. She looked weaker than I had ever seen her. The woman I had spent 38 years with barely looked like herself. She slowly opened her eyes when she heard my footsteps. Tears rolled down her face the moment she saw me. John, she whispered, I knew you might never forgive me, but I prayed you would come. I stood beside the bed without saying a word. My heart was filled with anger, sadness, and confusion all at once. She reached for my hand with the little strength she had left. Everything you saw was real, she said. I betrayed our marriage, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But there is one thing you still do not know. I looked at her and finally asked, Then tell me the truth. She closed her eyes for a moment before speaking. The man you think stole me from you was the one paying for my treatment after I stopped being able to afford it. When I wanted to give up, he refused to let me. I looked toward the hallway where the old man stood silently. I still could not forgive what they had done, but I could no longer ignore that the story was more complicated than I believed. My wife continued, I should have told you everything the day I became sick. Instead, I chose lies. And every lie pushed me further away from you. I felt tears in my eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. The betrayal was real. The pain was real. But so was the regret in her voice. Just then, the heart monitor beside her began beeping faster. Doctors rushed into the room and asked me to step outside. I stood frozen in the hallway as the doors closed in front of me. A few minutes later, the doctor walked out, looked directly at me, and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, we need to talk." I followed the doctor into a small consultation room, and before he even sat down, I knew the news was not going to be good. He placed a file on the table and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, your wife's condition is much worse than she allowed anyone to believe." For a moment, I forgot everything that had happened between us. The betrayal, the lies, the broken trust. None of it mattered as much as hearing those words. The doctor explained that she had been fighting the illness for years and had hidden how quickly it was getting worse. She had missed treatments, ignored warnings, and refused to tell her family the truth. I closed my eyes, wondering how the woman I once knew had carried such a heavy burden alone. As I walked back toward her room, I found the old man sitting quietly outside. He stood when he saw me and said, "I never wanted to replace you, John." I looked at him without speaking. "She came to me because she believed you deserved a peaceful life," he continued. "I told her she should tell you everything. But she was afraid you would give up your own life to save hers." I wanted to hate him. But I also knew he had not forced her to make those choices. They were hers. I entered the room again and sat beside my wife. She opened her eyes and gave me a weak smile. "I know I do not deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment before replying, "You broke my heart, and nothing can change that. But I do not want the last words between us to be filled with hate." Tears rolled down her face as she held my hand. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I squeezed her hand gently. No matter how much she had hurt me, 38 years of memories could not disappear overnight. Then she looked at me with fear in her eyes and quietly said, "John, there is one final truth I have never told you. And if I do not tell you now, you may never know who our son really is." Those words made my heart stop. I felt the room spin around me after hearing those words. I looked at my wife, hoping I had misunderstood, but the fear in her eyes told me I had not. "What do you mean?" I asked. She struggled to breathe before speaking again. "Our son is your son, John. Never doubt that." I let out a slow breath. I did not realize I had been holding. Then she continued, "But there is something about the day he was born that I hid from you all these years." She explained that during her pregnancy, doctors had discovered a serious complication that could have taken both her life and the baby's. She signed medical papers without telling me, because she was terrified I would choose to save her instead of our child if the worst happened. "I wanted that decision to be mine," she whispered. "I was wrong to hide it from you, just like I was wrong to hide everything else." Tears filled her eyes as she apologized again. I sat quietly, trying to understand how fear had turned into years of secrets. She looked at me and said, "I stopped telling the truth, because every new lie became easier than admitting the first one." Those words hurt because I knew they were true. One secret had slowly destroyed the trust we had built over nearly 4 decades. I held her hand for a long moment before saying, "I cannot erase what happened, and I cannot pretend it did not break me. But I also cannot spend the rest of my life carrying only anger." She closed her eyes, and for the first time since I arrived, she looked peaceful. A few minutes later, our son walked into the room after receiving the hospital's call. He looked from me to his mother, confused by the silence. I stood up, placed a hand on his shoulder, and quietly said, "Your mother has something she wants both of us to hear." As he moved closer to her bed, she gathered the little strength she had left, looked at both of us with tears in her eyes, and prepared to reveal the final secret that had haunted her for years. I stood beside my son as we waited for my wife to speak. Her breathing had become slow, and every word seemed to take all the strength she had left. She looked at both of us with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I have carried this guilt for too many years." My son gently held her hand and said, "Mom, whatever it is, just tell us." She nodded and looked at me first. "John, you spent 38 years loving me without asking for anything in return. You deserved honesty, but I gave you fear, lies, and silence." She turned toward our son. "And you deserve parents who trusted each other." The room became completely quiet. She took another deep breath before continuing. "The biggest mistake of my life was not falling in love with another man. The biggest mistake was believing I had to face everything alone. Every lie I told created another lie until I no longer knew how to come back. Tears rolled down her face as she looked at me. I never stopped loving you, John, but I stopped believing I deserved your love. I felt years of anger slowly giving way to sadness. Nothing she said could erase the betrayal, but I could finally see how fear had destroyed the woman I once knew. She reached into the drawer beside her bed and handed me a small envelope. I wrote this months ago, she whispered. I hoped you would never have to read it. I opened the envelope and found a letter addressed to me. In it, she apologized for every lie, thanked me for giving her the happiest years of her life, and asked me not to let bitterness become the final chapter of my story. By the time I looked up, she had closed her eyes. The heart monitor slowed, then let out one long, steady tone. Doctors rushed into the room, but I already knew. The woman I had loved, lost, hated, and forgiven was gone. I stood there holding her letter, realizing that some wounds never fully heal. But I also understood that carrying hate forever would only destroy the life I still had left. 10 years have passed since that day, and I still think about her every morning. I never forgot the betrayal, but I chose not to let it define the rest of my life. Sometimes forgiveness is not about the person who hurt you. Sometimes it is about finally setting yourself free. I could not believe what I had just heard. What do you mean? Who our son really is? I asked. My wife struggled to breathe before answering. Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, John, he is your son. He always has been. For a moment, I simply stared at her. Then why would you say something like that? She closed her eyes and said, because I let a lie grow for too many years, she explained, that long before she met the other man, someone had spread rumors that our son was not mine. She was terrified those rumors would one day destroy our family. But instead of telling me everything, she kept silent. As the years passed, the lie became another secret she carried. Then came her illness, then her affair, and one lie after another buried the truth even deeper. I sat there quietly, realizing how many chances we had wasted because we were both afraid to speak honestly. She looked at me and said, I never stopped loving you, John, but I stopped trusting you with my fears. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I had every reason to walk away, yet I also knew this was probably the last conversation we would ever have. I held her hand and said, you hurt me more than anyone ever could, but I refuse to let hatred be the last thing you remember from me. She began crying again. Thank you, she whispered. Just then, our son rushed into the room after receiving the hospital's call. He looked from me to his mother, confused by the tears on both our faces. My wife smiled weakly at him and said, your father never stopped being a good man. Do not ever forget that. A few moments later, the heart monitor let out one long, continuous tone. Doctors hurried into the room, but I already knew what had happened. I stood there holding the hand of the woman I had loved for 38 years, realizing that betrayal had ended our marriage long before that day. But forgiveness had found us just before goodbye. As I walked out of the hospital, I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier. A marriage is not destroyed by one mistake alone. It is destroyed by the silence that allows small lies to become impossible truths. 10 years have passed since that day, and the pain has never completely disappeared. But every morning I choose peace instead of anger. Because carrying bitterness only gives yesterday the power to steal today.